Lovely listener, good morning and welcome to BBC Radio London's Breakfast Show with me, Vanessa Feltz. As ever, thrilled to pieces to have your company this morning on the programme. And when I say this morning, it's Wednesday. It is the 21st of September. The weather looks a bit dismal, although it's not actually cold out there in London, just kind of darkish. The time 7 minutes past 7, and our top London story this morning, a Freedom of Information request by BBC London has revealed more than 100 pupils with special needs in the capital don't have a school to go to. 2 years after the biggest changes to the special needs system in a generation, parents in the capital say they're having to fight as hard as ever to get the right support from their local authority. Figures also show that across London, hundreds of families are in the process of taking legal action over special needs provision. David Simmons is the deputy leader of Hillingdon Council, which is one of the few London authorities where appeals have gone down.
The FOI figures show a period of transition as councils move from the old special educational needs statement process to the new education and healthcare plans, and they are designed to make it much easier for mums and dads to work with the local council to get the support that their child needs. But at a time when there's a rising population of children who are coming forward with special educational needs and a shortage of resources in some parts of the country, it's clear that many areas are facing challenges with that.
BBC Radio London's Anna O'Neill can tell us more about this story, and she joins me this morning. Anna, you've been doing the research into this. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Now, we've been talking about this big change that happened 2 years ago in the special needs education system. What was the change?
Well, back in 2014, September 2014, the government announced that they were going to carry out a much-needed shake-up of the special needs system, which for years had been running pretty dysfunctionally and causing parents of children with special needs to literally jump through hoops to get the right special needs provision for their children. So they announced, as David Simmons mentioned there, that they would be replacing the special needs statements with something called an education healthcare plan, which is kind of a holistic look at everything that the child needed, from what they might need in terms of therapeutic provision, and what they might need in terms of their healthcare, and joining all that up with their education to make sure that the child was looked at from every angle, and that the child and parent were put at the centre of the way that special needs was managed.
Well, that sounds admirable, and it sounds aspirational. It sounds like a terrific solution to an enormous problem. But what's happened in practice?
Well, we've decided to carry out this FOI, the Freedom of Information request, to all London councils to find out, give us a kind of snapshot of how that's working 2 years into this 4-year transition. And these are the results, Vanessa, that at least 108 children at the time of the FOI, which was in the last term, were out of school. I say at least because some councils didn't give us an exact figure. What they would say is the number is less than 10. So for those councils, I've taken the number to be the minimum possible, which is 1. So it could actually be a fair bit higher than that, Vanessa.
And is the reason because the range of special needs is so extreme and so immense that really it's a struggle to fit the child to the school or to cater to the specific bespoke needs of each child with special needs? Is it just because it's so complicated to do, or is it because there's some kind of failure in the system going on?
Well, it's incredibly complicated, and as you have been hearing, as we all know, there are limited funds that councils have to be able to manage the needs that they've got. And of course, a parent will always want the very best for their child. But it's not always the case that this is because parents are asking for too much. Sometimes it's because the child cannot be fit very easily into a school or a placement, and sometimes that child has been excluded, though those numbers are quite few and far between. So there are lots of different reasons why special needs children are not necessarily fitting into the system. But what is clear is that even now, 2 years into this transition period, something is not quite working.
I think that the very sad thing that we hear a great deal is about parents feeling that what they're doing on a daily basis is fighting. Instead of feeling helped and supported by the system, they feel as if they're fighting against the system. And that can be the most exhausting and debilitating thing, particularly when you've got a very demanding child with numerous quite complicated special needs. If you're caring for your child, your family, possibly trying to hold down a job as well, and also fighting the system, that's hard.
Indeed, and that's why the government brought in this system of mediation to try to, before a family feels that it has no other option but to go to a tribunal, there's now an option to have a mediation with your local authority so that you try to work things out. That's one of the changes that they brought in 2014. But what we're seeing is that despite that, hundreds of families, 275 families in fact, are in the process of going to tribunal with their local authority currently. 37 of those over their council's refusal to assess their child's special need in the first place, because of course once a child is assessed, if it's found to have a special need that needs a statement or an education healthcare plan, that means money. So in some cases, just getting the assessment in the first place is still a problem. And for others, it's about what's actually written on that healthcare plan.
We're going to be speaking to somebody in just that situation right now, Anna. So thank you very much indeed. Listening to this, Alastair Yates, who's had to fight, and we keep using this word, fight, to get the right provision for his son, Elian. Hello, Alastair. Thanks for joining us. Good morning.
Morning, Vanessa, and you're right. The word is fight. It's just horrible.
Explain what you've had to do and why you've had to fight and who you've had to fight.
Okay, we've been actually fighting, if that is the right word, with the Richmond Borough Council of London. It's a 5-month process that we went through. We had to pay for my son's schooling whilst this was going on because we decided to take him out of mainstream. So we gave mainstream a chance for a year, but it just didn't work for him. He couldn't cope with the 30-plus class sizes. He was criticized. He was bullied for having an LSA, a leading support assistant, with him. So he didn't build up a range of friends because of that. It was all just very, very hard for him in mainstream. And he was getting detentions. He was getting exclusions from school.
What would you say are his special needs? What is his situation?
Sure. Well, he is actually diagnosed clinically with ADHD and also oppositional defiant disorder and also social and communication disorders. So these three things make life really hard for him.
Yes.
And we try, it's very stressful, Vanessa, actually looking after a child with special needs. But, to fight a local authority on top of that is really cruel. And we just wanted it to take him out of mainstream, to give him a chance so that he could have a good education.
What have you been offered by the local authority?
Right, so what has happened is, and to be fair to Richmond Council, we were heading to a tribunal with them, but at the very last minute, they decided, because we'd got legal advice, which cost us a lot of money as well, of course, but they decided that we were right in the end, and that the school that we had chosen for my son was going to be a better place for him. They didn't, of course, and I don't say that the mainstream school was bad in any way. The Senko was excellent, the person who looks after all the special needs children. But, the point is, Vanessa, is that the Senkos are overstretched, the mainstream school staff are overstretched, and they just can't deal with all these special needs children. And the problem is that not only in our borough, but boroughs across the whole of the United Kingdom and obviously around London want these special needs children in mainstream. They don't want them to go out of mainstream, which is ridiculous.
Well, thank you for talking to us.
Parents of special needs children in London say they are having to fight as hard as ever to get the right support from their local authority. 2 years after the biggest changes to the system in a generation was meant to simplify assessments. This Freedom of Information request by the BBC revealed that hundreds of families are taking their local councils to tribunal, and more than 100 special needs children don't have a school to go to. Well, Eva Akins is a special needs education specialist at Russell Cooke Solicitors and joins me on the line now. Eva, thank you for talking to us this morning, and good morning.
Good morning.
So just if you would, tell us what you read from these Freedom of Information figures.
Well, I think that there are two really concerning things that jump out from those figures. The first is that there are over 100 children that are being denied their basic human right to an education, and those children are some of the most vulnerable. I think the other thing that's really concerning is that after £500 million worth of investment by the government in SEN reforms that were designed to improve the system, in fact, we see that there are still just as many, if not more, cases going to appeal, which means that there are delays for children, some including those children out of education, in in getting a school placement or the right provision for them, which means that the dialogue that should be happening between local authorities and parents just isn't happening.
What concerns you most?
What concerns me most is that these are very vulnerable children who are not receiving an education or are receiving an inadequate education in the wrong kind of placement. Parents are having to really, really fight to get the local authority to engage with them. And what concerns me most is that local authorities are not really being held to account. And so it's difficult to see how that situation is going to improve for these really, really vulnerable families.
Now, our reporter Anna O'Neill, who spoke to us earlier about the families ending up in tribunal with their councils, could you perhaps explain that process for us?
Yes, so before we get to the appeal stage, you have a 20-week process usually involving the local authority and parents conducting an assessment for children and going through a process of asking for information from some experts, and then they come together and should be reaching agreement about what sort of provision that child needs, for example, occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, and then going on to decide what's the right placement for that child. What commonly occurs is that there are problems in that process because there might be a dispute about whether the child should have what's called an education, health and care plan at all, or what that provision should be, where they should go to school. Often that's a conflict about the costs involved in a particular placement or a provision for that child. Once you get to the end of that process, if there's not agreement, a parent then lodges an appeal, and it's then a 20-week process again before an appeal is heard. Although what often happens is that an agreement will be reached quite far into that appeal process because there is a settlement at some stage.
Eva, people listening to this are going to go, hang on a minute, this is 2 years after the biggest changes to the system. Why haven't appeals gone down significantly? I mean, what would you say is the reason?
Well, the reason is because despite the new legislation looking like it would make a really good, a good inroad into the difficulties that there were, the local authorities don't appear to be complying with the statutory timetable for getting their part of the process done. They don't appear to be taking much notice of the culture change that was supposed to be introduced, that really was supposed to put parents and children at the heart of the process and make the system a lot less adversarial. I think that's the key difficulty, and that's why parents are still having to go to appeal in order to get the local authority to engage properly with them. And what's unfortunate about that is that many children don't have parents with the resources or the know-how to engage in an appeal process. So there are a large number of children whose parents simply aren't going to appeal and their needs aren't being met. Many of those will be the ones that are out of education altogether at the moment in London.
I mean, that's such a sorry state of affairs. And, it suggests if you can't afford to pay for a lawyer, you're more like, what happens is your child doesn't get any chance then. Yes, go on.
The real cost here is first of all to the individual child who's likely to have their life chances significantly decreased, but also to wider society, because if we're not investing in interventions for those vulnerable children at an early stage, their educational outcomes are going to be much less positive, and they're more likely to end up dependent on state-funded services in adulthood, such as social care, health, and in the worst case scenario, the criminal justice system, at huge expense to society as a whole.
So, Eva, this is a 4-year transition, apparently. What does the government need to do over the final 2 years of this to help those parents?
Well, I would say that one positive thing that is about to happen is that special educational needs departments of the local authorities are about to be Ofsted inspected. They're a department that hasn't been subject to that sort of scrutiny before, and I think that if they are held to account by Ofsted in those assessments, and if they've got large numbers of children out of education or they're not meeting their statutory deadlines, that they should be assessed as requiring improvement. And I think that will be of concern to the local authorities and perhaps be the impetus for change for them.
Eva Akins, thank you so very much for joining us this morning.